Hello. Welcome to Sterling Harmston's The Basics of Disease Control COVID-19 for Churches module. My name is Dr. Bridget Sterling, and I'm an epidemiologist. But more than that, I'm a follower of Jesus. I have worked as a missionary for many years overseas, and have had many experiences working with different infectious diseases to control them and to help people to understand how they move from one person to another. So I'm very pleased to be able to share with the churches a little bit about what is an infection, to learn about how COVID-19 moves from one person to another, and to describe ways to decrease the risk of infection from COVID-19. I just want to remind us that we're all in this together. This is not something new. Diseases have been around for as long as there's been people. And so we know that as a whole body of Christ, as we're looking at this whole crisis, that we're not alone. We're together, and we can also be really coming together as a group and being prayerful and thoughtful and using wisdom as we work together to keep each other safe. So let's think from the beginning here. What is an infection? Well, the world is full of living and non-living things that are too small to see, and we call those things microorganisms. And your human body is teeming with microorganisms, both inside and out. In fact, we wouldn't be healthy without them. We need microorganisms to help us to break down our food, for example, in our gut. And we have what's called a microbiome, or a whole garden full of different microbes in many different places. For example, our skin has a microbiome. Our eyes have a microbiome. Our gut. We have microbiome that help us to keep safe and be healthy. So we're not afraid of microorganisms, but we are aware that there are some microorganisms that are harmful, and those ones are called germs or pathogens. The human immune system are generally equipped to protect people from becoming sick. So actually we do a pretty good job, our bodies do a good job of living with and dealing with millions of microorganisms that we're encountering every day. But when pathogens enter the body and begin to multiply, that's when we have what's called an infection. And when we have an infection, we don't feel well. You can see in the picture here that this young lady is just not herself. She's probably got a headache, maybe she's got a fever, her body is probably inflamed. And those are all issues and problems, but they also help us to understand that something is wrong, that there's a pathogen that's invaded our body. So epidemiologists like to think of how diseases move from one person to another in a chain of infection. So this is how we think of it, is how we're linking one sick person to expose a pathogen to another person who's not yet sick. And each link in the chain represents a step that has to be present in order for an infection to occur. If one of those links is missing, a new infection is prevented. And so it's helpful for all of us to understand how that chain can be broken, right? There's opportunities to break that chain so that we can intervene and prevent cases of, for example, COVID-19. So here's a picture that I like to use to help us think about that chain. So if this chain was full together and not broken, then we would see an infection. But let's break it down piece by piece so we can think about how we're going to break the chain of infection. So let's start with the infectious agent. And as I go through, you'll notice that I try and highlight in red the part of the chain that I'm talking about. So the infectious agent can be any disease-causing microorganism. And I mentioned before that we call those pathogens or bad microbes. So if we look at this slide, we can see that there are many different kinds of pathogens. They could be, for example, fungi, parasites, or bacteria. But in the case of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, we're really focusing in and narrowing down on viruses. And in this case, a coronavirus. And you'll see the little picture of a virus there has the little spike proteins coming out of it. That kind of looks like a crown, or certainly did when they first looked at it under the initial microscopes that they had. And so scientists called it corona or crown virus. So what do we know about viruses? Well, we know that viruses are small little pieces of genetic material They're little pieces of protein, essentially. They're not able to make new viruses outside of the body, and they don't actually live very long without a host. So if we think about it, we kind of look at a coronavirus or this pandemic as if we're fighting some kind of an enemy. Viruses can't think. Viruses can't plan. They're not clever. They need us to spread from one person to another. So really, it's our behavior and what we do that causes infection, because on their own, it's not like they can come out and crawl around and jump into another person. It's us that allows that to happen. So some other things we need to know about viruses: they're not treated with antibiotics. Those are for bacteria. So if you had a cold, which was caused by a coronavirus or a rhinovirus, and you were to take antibiotics, it would not help. In fact, it would probably make it worse. We also should know that some viruses, of course, can be prevented by having a previous vaccine, like measles. So we could have had a vaccine for chickenpox, right? And then we come into contact with someone who has chickenpox. We don't get it. So that's terrific. And there are also some antiviral medications which we can use for people, for example, who have HIV. And so if someone has the virus HIV, then they're able to take antivirals that allow them to live even potentially a normal span of life. And some viruses, like the one that causes COVID-19, didn't have a vaccine to prevent it because it was new, or any effective medications to treat it. However, we are now seeing that there are some vaccines that are coming out that are potentially very helpful and very effective, and are going to hopefully help us to get back to a more normal way of life. There are also better treatments that are coming out, things like monoclonal antibodies, which are going to help us as well. If we can know about the COVID infection early on, then we can have early treatment and people will do much better. So there is hope, absolute hope on the way. So now let's think about reservoirs. We spoke about the infectious agent. What about the susceptible reservoir? Well, reservoirs are the places that the germ normally exists. So germs don't just unless they somehow come from space, they don't just appear, right? So they've been somewhere else and then they move into humans, or they've been in another population and they move into the human population that we're concerned about. So they can be anywhere. So if we just think generally of pathogens, they can be in humans, they can be on equipment, they can be in animals or insects in the cases of things like rabies or malaria, right? So we can see different carriers of different pathogens. We could have pathogens in water like we see in hepatitis A. And we can have pathogens in food, like you'll sometimes see in an outbreak of salmonella or something like that. For SARS-CoV-2, the natural reservoir is unknown, but there have been documented cases, such as minks, that have both been infected and infecting humans. So it's possible that there is going to be more information learned in the future about where that natural reservoir is. But at present time, it's still a mystery. And there is a zoonotic link, or an animal link, to most infectious diseases. And so about 75% of emerging diseases are zoonotic. So as we interact more with different kinds of animals, we are becoming exposed to the pathogens that live within them, and then they cross over into humans. And these are some examples of transmission types for different infectious diseases. So now let's think about COVID-19. So again, as I said, the virus origin is unknown, and it's possible that it comes from bats. And that's just from looking at the genetic makeup of COVID-19 and thinking SARS-CoV-2 and thinking about how it's possible that it came from bats, just from the code that people are reading. And there can definitely be transmission between humans and animals. We've seen, as I mentioned, dogs and cats and other animals like minks become infected as well. And in the case of minks, it's quite interesting because minks have actually been able to then infect humans as well. So that's a different scenario. The main reservoirs, though, are the infected humans and the air that they breathe and the things that their hands and mucus touch. So those are the things, the real true reservoir is humans at this point. And so what can we do to reduce the reservoir on our bodies? So it's about wearing a mask or a face shield. We can also limit the use of things like rings and watches and necklaces. We can limit having long nails or nail polish. We can limit having long sleeves, except if you're using an isolation gown for some reason. And we can wash our clothes and our handbags and shower and bathe frequently. If you're somebody who has SARS-CoV-2, if you have an infection of it, COVID-19, and you are unwell, you are spewing throughout the process of your illness, and it could be even if you're asymptomatic. You are spewing up to 100 billion viral particles. And as you do that, those particles are landing on your clothes, and they're in your nails. They're on your mask, right? If you're wearing a mask, they're in your hair. So we do have to keep our bodies clean, our things clean, because we don't want to risk infecting other people. And so that's just one of the ways that we can reduce the reservoir of infection on our bodies. And again, as I want to remind you, SARS-CoV-2 viruses are not living, right? They need a cell to replicate. So when the virus enters the body via the nose, eyes, or mouth, it must attach itself to a host cell and then inject its genetic material, and in this case it's RNA, into the cell. Then the infected cell uses the SARS-CoV-2 RNA to make replicas of the viral genome. Each infected cell then can release millions of copies of the virus before the cell finally breaks down and becomes inactivated. So we want to keep that reservoir of little viral particles, especially those that are active and could cause infection, to an absolute minimum. One of the questions that people often ask is, what is the period of transmissibility? Well, the incubation period is usually from 3 to 7 days. And that means that the time that it takes to launch an actual infection from the time that I have become exposed to somebody with COVID-19 until I actually start to see signs and symptoms. And SARS-CoV-2 can be detected in people 1 to 3 days before they start to have symptoms. So it's taking those days before I actually start to feel unwell. The highest volume of viral load is observed around the day of symptom onset. So the first day when I start to feel like, oh, I got a headache and I feel feverish and I feel a little unwell, that's when I'm most infectious. Viable virus has been isolated from asymptomatic people for 1 to 2 weeks, for those with moderate disease for up to 3 weeks, and longer for those with severe disease. And I might add here that people who have lowered immune systems because of other diseases or because they're on medication to lower their immunity because they've had a transplant or something, they are unlikely to show as many symptoms of the disease as other people. They're more likely to be asymptomatic. However, they're also less likely to be able to mount a good immune response, which means that they will be more infectious for longer. So it really depends. You hear about super spreaders. Well, what's a super spreader, right? It might be somebody who is able to keep walking around, doesn't feel so sick that they're confined to their bed, but their immune system is not fighting the disease off. And so therefore they are spewing many, many viruses, maybe infected even higher up in their respiratory tract, so that more virus is actually able to exit the body in its activated form and potentially infect up to 20, 30 people. Active virus is typically not detected by nasopharyngeal testing beyond 8 to 10 days after symptom onset. So that's really when you're spewing virus, you should be able to find it in your nose and in your nasopharyngeal area, in that place way back where the nurse or physician would be testing from. So after that period of time, you actually wouldn't be able to tell if you had the disease. I now want to draw your attention to something that could happen anywhere. Once again, we need to think about when someone gets infected, that there is no one to blame. It's not like you go looking for, who's the bad person to blame here. People are not to blame when somebody else gets infected. It's simply what happened. And we very often will stop and try and figure out what happened. So let's have a look at this scenario here. In this scenario, we've got 2 girls, young people, who are at a youth outreach, and they're having a great time. This is on November 1st. And a little while later, that girl goes home, and one of the girls, Sam, starts to feel unwell, and she realizes that In fact, she's got some symptoms, but could be anything, could be allergies, could be something else, so she's not too worried about it. And then a couple days later, her friend goes to work at her job as a server at a care home. And then that server goes and serves people some food, including one of the older ladies there. And then a little while later, she hears that that woman's unwell. And by the time that she contacts her people to say, "Ooh, I just found out that I've been in contact with someone who's COVID positive," then the original girl goes to get tested. It's been such a long time that she tests negative now, even though she was the original positive. And then, of course, by that point, having had no symptoms, the young person's like, "Oh, now I'm testing positive," and the person that she was caring for is in the ICU. We hear about this all the time. This is a very, very common scenario. So what ends up happening, just like has happened to one of my colleagues' family members, that there's in one case there was a young girl, she's at school, as she should be, she's having a great time. They find out that the school, though, is now overrun with COVID-19 cases and becomes shut down. And then that girl is now at home. Well, she unfortunately has passed on COVID to her mother, who was asymptomatic, but who was visiting her father, so now the grandfather, who is in one of the risk categories for having underlying diseases and being of an older age. And now that person, unfortunately, is very ill. Now, is that anybody's fault? Of course not. We don't go looking for fault. It's not blame, but it's recognizing, what do we know about the reservoir of disease? Well, the reservoir of disease is going to be in people. And we know that children, for example, are wonderful spreaders of disease. My children always had runny noses and coughs and all kinds of great things when they were, younger school-age kids. Now they're teenagers. We don't see that as much, but especially in that age. And as they get older, they still can absolutely be carriers of disease, and unfortunately see older people getting unwell. And so this is a common thing that will happen. It takes time, and by the time that the young person goes to get tested, they likely would be negative by that point anyway, because they're past the symptom time. So we don't want to be spreaders. So how do we not be spreaders? Well, you've been hearing a lot about 6 feet or 2 meters or that sort of thing, and that's the distance that little droplets usually are able to be propelled. And so that's why we mention that, is that we don't want you to be propelling droplets to anyone in a area around yourself. So if we're just concerned about droplets, then staying 6 feet or more away will be very helpful. Obviously, you want to wear a mask if you can at different times, depending on what you're doing. We want people to stay home if they're sick and to get tested if they have symptoms. We also want people to wash their hands, right? Very important. So these are all things we know. There's nothing new. These are the really important things that we've been doing. Johns Hopkins mentioned this right at the beginning of the epidemic. They had a wonderful pyramid that said, stay distant, stay home if you're sick, make sure that you're getting tested if you have symptoms, make sure that you are washing your hands and washing your clothes and washing yourself. And then, of course, also, if you have access to and you're able to, wear a mask. So these are the things that we know. So let's move on. So once we have an infectious agent that is in a susceptible reservoir, it has to then get out of that person in a portal of exit. It has to move from the reservoir into another person. So how does that happen? Well, viruses are by nature very good at exiting people. How do they exit? Well, when you get sick, you're obviously going to have more mucus, and that's how it wants to exit, through droplets. And we can actually, even just by breathing, by talking, by laughing, by singing, by yelling, all of these things we can spread. Viruses can exit our bodies. And viruses also exit in different ways, like through sex and through coughing, sneezing, and even through urine and stool. The WHO has more recently said that they feel that there is a possible mode of exit through urine and stool for transmission. So mucus secretions blast into the air through sneezing. So when you're sick, right? A virus is very good at making you sneeze, right? And then you will sneeze, and as you sneeze or cough, then droplets will go everywhere. Now, one of the students in my class at one point had asked me at the university, she said, hey, do you think, though, that just because I'm a smoker, in her case, she said, I'm a smoker and I'm coughing, so I can probably still be here. And I said, I understand what you're saying. You feel that you're coughing not because you have COVID-19, but because you smoke. But my problem is that if you're asymptomatic and you are carrying COVID-19, and then you cough because you're a smoker, then I'm still going to have those mucus secretions blasting into the air. So no, you can't be here. So it doesn't really matter why someone's coughing. It's the fact that they are coughing that could be spreading those droplets, which maybe you are an asymptomatic carrier of COVID-19. I don't know. So droplets are coughed or laughed or sung out, and they're breathed in by a person, or they land on some kind of a surface or object. And the other way that sometimes people will transmit COVID, it will exit through diarrhea. And so if you're using a toilet where someone has become unwell and they have diarrhea, and then you flush the toilet and that kind of goes into the air, that's a possible exit. And so steps to stopping germs from leaving reservoirs, well, wear a mask. Also use cough suppressant like cough drops or cough syrup if you have a tickle in your throat. If you are somebody who smokes, or you have asthma or some other thing that tickles your throat and makes you cough, well, then you're going to have to stop coughing somehow. Cover your sneezes and throw away used tissue. Don't keep them up in your, some people put them in their pockets or whatever else. Don't do that. Stay home if you're sick. And if you must go out, wear a mask and stay at least 6 feet away from other people. And don't unnecessarily touch surfaces. And as I mentioned before, if there's a problem, there could be a problem of spreading disease through toilets, then close the lid of the toilet before flushing. Don't just flush the toilet and allow the force of the air to aerosolize the virus into the air. Okay, now let's think about how pathogens move from the reservoir into the new host. So we've talked about the infectious agent, we've looked at the susceptible reservoir, we've imagined the portals of exit, and now there has to be some mode of transmission that brings the virus into the next person. So let's think about that. So as I mentioned before, germs are coughed or sneezed directly onto a person's hand. So if this person was thinking in a very safe way, they could have either coughed or sneezed into their inner elbow, or they could have used a tissue. But sometimes people don't. They cough or sneeze into their hand, and then they bring those droplets to something like a table or a doorknob or something else. And then another person touches the doorknob with germs on it, and then rubs their eye or touches their face or their mask or something else. So that was contact transmission, but there's also droplet transmission. And this is the main way that SARS-CoV-2 moves from person to person. Droplets are spread from the nose and mouth of the infected person. And due to their weight, so droplets are more than 5 microns, which in microbiological terms is actually quite heavy. They don't stay in the air for long, okay, so they can't travel that far. And then they land on surfaces, but they may also land on people's skin or lips or eyes. And then they break apart. So the issue, though, is that if you cough or sneeze and you have a very mucousy exudate that's coming out of you, then unfortunately it can come out in something that's a little bit more like a mist or a cloud. And as it clumps together, it actually can potentially hang on the air a little bit more and cause there to be a little bit more travel, which we don't love. Sneezes contain as many as 40,000 droplets in them. And coughs contain about 3,000 droplets. So less, but still significant. The number of droplets varies by individual. We all know that. We've had, we know that there are people that do speak with a lot of moisture, that sort of spit when they speak. And droplets can also be influenced by temperature. They can be influenced by light or UVC radiation, by airflow in the room, and by the environmental humidity as well. Droplets can travel as far as 2 meters, as I mentioned before, and soon after leaving the human body, droplets began to evaporate and lose their mass. The largest droplets are completely evaporated before falling 2 meters away. Smaller droplets, though, can travel. So we actually see smaller droplets moving potentially up to 6 meters way after a sneeze, which is huge, more than 2 meters after a cough, and about a meter away from normal breathing. And so this is what it would look like. So if I am the person walking and breathing in on the right-hand side, and my friend is coming down the hallway, and he has an infection of COVID-19, and he begins to breathe, well, those breath droplets are only going to fall within a meter. But then he has a cough. Well, that cough droplet can come at least 2 meters, and then he sneezes, and all of those tens of thousands of droplets come flying out of him, and they can actually travel as much as 6 meters. And remember that although we have more than 100 billion particles that are being spewed, that are SARS-CoV-2 particles that are being spewed during the course of an infection, much of those particles are not virus that can actually cause disease transmission. The problem is that clearly many of them have, because if we look at our population, we have such high infection rates with SARS-CoV-2. It is very infectious. So we do need to be concerned when we're out walking around and being especially indoors with people who are especially coughing and sneezing. So when a person breathes in, they inhale air from a pocket of air that is up to 15 centimeters tall, so about half the size of a ruler. And air flows from the lower part of the human body and is drawn up into the mouth with every breath. About 2/3 of the total inhaled air comes from the air below the mouth. So as you can see, if I'm within a meter and talking to somebody, and they are talking or coughing or sneezing or singing or doing something, then those droplets coming out of their mouth are going to be coming down, right? But as they evaporate, I am breathing from about 2/3 of the air that I'm breathing is coming from below my mouth. So it actually is very easy for somebody to breathe in the viral particles that somebody else is breathing out when they are within 1 meter of each other. Also remember that hot air rises. So we also have some element of the virus coming in a little bit of a cloud that forms a bit of an upsurge. So that was droplets. The other and slightly more controversial question related to SARS-CoV-2 is the transmissibility via aerosols. So what happens when somebody is breathing out respiratory aerosols? Well, aerosols are particles that can suspend in the air. Remember I mentioned before that droplets are, from a microbiological perspective, relatively heavy. But aerosols are very, very light. And when humans are ill, small sheets and strands of liquefied mucus can stretch across the airway. Mucus forms all along the airway, including deep within the lungs, that can bubble up into the air during the vibrations of speech. So even as I'm speaking to you now, the way that you are hearing what I'm saying is through vibrations. So as I'm breathing out and speaking, there are little mucus bubbles coming out of my mouth. It's kind of gross to think, but that's what's happening. This is made more pronounced, though. If I'm unwell, right? More mucus production. But also it's made more pronounced if I'm yelling or cheering or singing or coughing. The airflow produced breaks apart the sheets of music like blowing a soap bubble, and they float out into the air. The other day I was at the beach, and there was somebody, their wonderful family was gathered together, and they were having a great time. And one of the things that they were doing as an activity was blowing soap bubbles. And I thought, what a lovely activity, until some of the soap bubbles floated over to where my family was, and they were popping right in front of my family. And I thought, can't do this during a pandemic. So I had to sadly go over and tell them I love what you're doing and how wonderful it is. And of course I said this from many feet away. But please don't blow bubbles because they're popping over in our area, and it was a very good visual reminder to me about one of the things that is happening when people are really exuding themselves through the things that we do, like yelling and cheering and singing. So that was a good reminder for me. SARS-CoV-2 is light. The actual virus itself is extremely light and small, and it can stay suspended in air, even riding on tiny dust particles. Do you know when you go to the movie theater and you look up at the light above you and you can see all the tiny little dust particles? Well, imagine that the virus loves to fly and surf basically on top of those, and you breathe in those dust particles all the time. Traditionally, it was believed that most respiratory diseases were transmitted via droplets that have a short lifespan in the air. But the WHO reports that SARS-CoV-2 transmission is primarily via coarse respiratory droplets and contact routes, but normal breathing and talking can result in exhaled aerosols. There was an experimental study using a nebulizer that found that SARS-CoV-2 could remain viable in aerosols for at least 3 hours. There has been a question from the beginning as to how on earth this virus spread around the whole world so very quickly. Yes, in droplets, but there may be a fairly significant element of airborne transmission as well. Other RNA viruses like measles use airborne route to travel far in the air, and we know that SARS-CoV-2 is not like measles, but we need to try and understand how this virus has spread so rapidly throughout our populations. And one of the questions is, what is the role of airborne transmission? We know that measles can remain infectious for 2 hours, and just breathing the contaminated air will cause an infection. And 90% of susceptible people close to a person with measles will become infected. Of course, we know more about measles because we've had it around longer. More is being learned about SARS-CoV-2 all the time. And as that information is revealed to us, then we're going to be able to protect ourselves better. So let's look at the next step. So we started with the infectious agent. We looked at the susceptible reservoir and the portal of exit and mode of transmission. And now we need to look at the portal of entry, or how the pathogen actually gets into the host. Well, as I mentioned before, a person infected with a virus could shed up to 100 billion viral particles in the course of their infection. How much virus you inhale in the initial dose and the amount of virus a person has in the body at any one time may worsen the severity of a viral disease. What this means is that there is a dose-response relationship. So if I was standing next to somebody and that person had an infection of COVID-19, how long I was standing there would matter. How close I was to that person would matter, because the amount of virus that enters my body and begins to replicate before my immune system has a chance to mount a defense is important. So we are concerned about how long we stay in the company of people who are not in our circle, and we also are concerned about how close we are to that person, because then even if we do get an infection, hopefully that infection will be less. In areas with COVID-19 community transmission, the WHO advises that all health workers and caregivers should continually wear medical masks during all routine activities and throughout the entire shifts. But what does that mean for us if we're exposed or engaging with vulnerable people? So it could be in your church activities that you're working with older people. It could be that you're working in a soup kitchen. It could be that you are working with street people or with people with disability. So in any of these cases, when you're working with people who you know to be vulnerable, should you wear a mask? It is likely that you should. Should you wear eye protection? It is likely that you should. That protects both you, and it also helps to protect the other people that you're working with. And I know that there's a lot of controversy around this because people are questioning, is it worth it? And one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that there are different modifiers of disease that have different levels of protection against SARS-CoV-2. And I like to call this the Swiss cheese model. So what I mean by this is that the things that we do, like wearing a mask or like physical distancing or having eye protection or cleaning and sanitizing, we know that there are different levels of amount of protection that each of these activities gives. But what we don't know is to what extent all of them give protection. So let's just take physical distancing, for example. If we all physically distanced, we could, as a society, reduce SARS-CoV-2 transmission by about 10.2%. Now you might be thinking, oh, well then it's hardly worth it because 10% reduction is not worth all of the hassle that we've all been through. And I don't ever want to undermine all of the pain and hassle and difficulty that everybody's been through during this time of infection, of pandemic. But physical distancing as a society would reduce by about 10.2%. On the other hand, eye protection, so covering your eyes, wearing eyeglasses, wearing shields, protects about 10.6%. Wearing a mask, an additional 14.3%. Now, these are not necessarily standalone reductions. What I mean by that is that some of the reduction from physical distancing may also be included in your eye protection and wearing a mask. So we say that they are complementary interventions and not necessarily exclusive. But what you can start to do is say, well, if I physical distance and I wear eye protection and I wear a mask and I clean my hands and wash my body and I maybe use some nasal spray with iodine, or I screen for symptoms, or I use point of care testing, or I use good ventilation and fans, then that kind of protection working together becomes stronger. So maybe one intervention would allow transmission to happen more often. Add 2, add 3, add all of them. And then what happens? So we start to add the different layers, and eventually it becomes harder and harder for disease to move through those people. Let's look at it a different way. So we said that wearing a face mask carries a 14.3% risk difference versus if you don't wear a mask. This means out of 100 people who do not wear a mask, we would expect 17 to contract SARS-CoV-2, where only 3 in 100 of those who wore a mask would. That seems pretty good. I think if I had a choice to be in which of these groups, I think I'd want to be on the one on the left. And again, wearing eye protection carries a 10.6% risk difference than not wearing eye protection. So again, I think I'd want to be in the group that was wearing protection. And here's another group about keeping distancing. So again, I would want to be in the group that was doing the interventions. And what if you were doing all of them, right? So your risk would get less and less and less. So that was talking about and thinking about the portals of entry. And now let's move to the last link in the chain, which is the susceptible host. So what can make someone susceptible? Well, obviously all humans are potentially susceptible to a viral infection. But there are some things that make us more likely to both get SARS-CoV-2 and to also allow it to be more transmissible. So different populations have shown that age or sex, whether male or female, stress, habits, hygiene, pre-existing disease, and ethnicity have been important factors for considering susceptibility. And we've heard a lot about older people, but is it really all about chronological age? Well, you can test your COVID risk based on age, ethnicity, comorbidities, and other diseases, comorbidities such as other diseases like diabetes, and also by gender. And this is a link that you could go to if you're interested in, you can pause the video here and write that down and go to the link. If you're interested in taking your test that will tell you your chronological age. And using this assessment, for example, a 40-year-old male with Asian ancestry and a BMI of 37 and a history of asthma is a 4 scoring, which makes them a medium risk category, right, according to that risk assessment. And a 70-year-old Caucasian female with uncomplicated diabetes and a BMI of 25 is also a medium risk. So even though one person is 40 and the other person 70, their risk factors actually put them in the same category. So it's not all about chronological age, although of course that is important. There are other factors that seem to make people more at risk for for COVID-19. And I really like the way that the British speak of those people who are at risk, which is to say that these are people who require shielding. So it's not about, oh, you're vulnerable, like someone's getting ready to attack you. you require shielding. You're somebody in our society who we think requires some extra protection at this time in this pandemic. And there's lots of things that people can do to reduce their risk of infection as well. So it's not just about their ethnicity and their BMI and their underlying conditions. There are other things that people can do to shore up their defenses against COVID-19. There's a lot of talk about hand hygiene. One of the nice things that I love to get kids to do is to sing happy birthday. They can really try to get a long period of time of hand washing, 40 to 60 seconds, which can be quite significantly longer than most people actually wash their hands, if they wash their hands at all. And I also like to encourage people to properly use an alcohol-based hand sanitizer as well. And if there's any risk of contact with body substances, that people should wear gloves. So if you've got a group in Sunday school that are working with kids and something happens, then there should be gloves available. There should be also some kind of an apron or gown of some sort that someone could put on in case they needed to clean up a substance like mucus or vomit or anything else that might happen. And we know that does happen sometimes. We need to teach coughing and sneezing etiquette, right? So if you're going to cough or sneeze, make sure you cough or sneeze into I call it with children, I call it your cough pocket. Everybody find your cough pocket and cough and sneeze into that, which is, the medical word for it is your anticubita fossa, which is your inner elbow. And use tissue. And after you use tissue, throw them away. And after you throw it away, wash your hands, right? So we know about coughing and sneezing etiquette, and it doesn't hurt to remind people. We also should be in a clean and well-ventilated environment. It means decluttering, making sure we get all of the things out that don't need to be around, especially in pandemic times. We need to clean anything that has been contaminated. We need to make sure that we have soap and water on hand in good amounts and paper towel. We also need to have disinfectant. So we wash surfaces with soap and water, and then we dry surfaces, and then we disinfect, and then we leave that to air dry. We open windows, and we consider the airflow in the building. How is the ventilation? What's happening with the HVAC in our building? Is it recycling air? That's not a good idea right now. Do we have good filters in our HVAC? Is there a way to open windows and turn on fans to increase the airflow in our buildings? These are all things we should be thinking about. So let's look at this as a case study. So welcome to Central Church, which is a place for everyone. The doors are open to people from all over Central City. Alongside their full to capacity Sunday school services, there are weekly Bible studies, there's small groups, there's choir practice, there's committees and outreach events and more. Central Church is a great place to be. So we have a children's coordinator. Her name is Jessica, and she normally organizes great events for kids from all over the city. But now we have a pandemic, and the church was shut for a few months, and she's being asked to start it back up. Jessica wants to know a few things before she invites groups of kids back into the church building. First, Jessica wants to understand what's happening in Central City's epidemic. This is a medium-sized city with a population of about 200,000 people. So she wants to ask the question, what is COVID transmission doing in her local community? She phones her local public health center and discovers the following. She asks about incidents. Well, there's 25 new cases, meaning that there were 25 cases in the last day. What's the prevalence? There's 104 existing cases, which means there are 104 active cases of COVID-19 in her population. Where are most cases coming from? Well, she finds out that it's mostly from travel and mostly from healthcare-related outbreaks. So does this seem like community transmission to Jessica? What do you think? Well, it's not. There is absolutely still risk for disease, but this seems like isolated outbreaks and migratory infections. So it doesn't seem like this is something that is a community transmission scenario. So next, Jessica wants to think about the risk to the population that she's working with. Do youth and children have severe infections? Who do youth and children interact with? Are they likely to abide by prevention protocols? Will I need to do some training? What will kids understand? Well, Jessica knows how easily children spread respiratory infections. In fact, she remembers how last year all of the kids had runny noses by December. So that was something she can recall and think logically, kids do transmit diseases very easily amongst each other. So Jessica sends out an email to the parents explaining that the church has decided to restart the children's programs. She also sends along some coloring pages for the kids on the new ways that they're going to be together. She also contacts the youth and invites them to a Zoom meeting to discuss the new ways of meeting together. So I want you to pause the video now and think about Jessica's situation and what she's found out so far. So why don't you think about all of the different aspects of the chain of infection, the different links? So for example, what is the agent in this scenario? What's the reservoir? What are the different portals of exit that the disease might use to go from one person to another in relation to the youth ministry and children's ministry? What mode of transmission would be most likely? And how would the disease move from one person to another? How might it enter the susceptible host? And who is the susceptible host in this case? So pause the video now and answer those questions for yourself. These are the answers that I came up with. You might have gotten different answers, and that's perfectly okay. If you want to pause it and read this, you're most welcome to. There are many things for Jessica and the church leadership to consider. They should prayerfully consider the reopening of the kids' ministry. They should communicate the risks with family and kids as appropriate. I mean, not to scare the children, but just to let them know in an age-appropriate way what the risks are. So let's be transparent with each other. They should be prepared to dial back the service as the situation changes. So I often like to think of infection control as a tap and not a switch. It's not something we turn on and turn off. We don't have a program one day and we don't have it the next, and we do have it the day after that. But we might say, well, we're going to do some things and not everything. They should also screen for symptoms and vulnerabilities, and that might take place like a questionnaire. And I have included in the communities of practice, I've included a sample questionnaire in the resources section where you could ask people what their symptoms are, and you may even ask them to self-screen for their vulnerabilities, to make choices about whether they want to come in. Limit your numbers and be able to keep track of everyone involved, at least at first. And then you can slowly, as things unveil themselves, you can increase that number. Provide hand sanitizer and increase washing stations for hands. Provide masks and tissues as needed. And continue to watch the changing guidelines provided for those who are charged with public health authority. And we're meant to listen to those in authority over us, aren't we? And then make sure that the environment is clean and well ventilated. Your church should have an infection control plan that is outlining policies and guidelines to help keep you safe as you work and as you worship and as you serve. You should know where to find those policies, and you should know your responsibilities related to the policies and procedures of your church. Were the objectives of this course met? Did we describe what infection is? Did we learn about how COVID-19 moves from one person to another? Did we describe ways to decrease the risk of infection to COVID-19? Here's some of the information that we used in order to make this module of the course. And here are some of the terms that we may have used that could be helpful for you to know. Thank you for your time, and I pray that God will bless you as you continue to ministry to people, whether that is in person, whether that's online, whether that's on the phone, that you would be ever so blessed, and that this time would be a time of growth, both personally and in your churches. Amen.